Okay. Tell me when. Folks. Wait a minute. Okay. Everything working?
Yeah.
All right. We're just doing a rough tape of this book, which is my traveling book. My name is Phil Ochs, and this is Boris the dog. Okay. Okay, here's the book. We have number 21 columnar book, bought in 2nd Avenue below 44th Street, near the old Friends of Chile office. You can see through the camera okay, right? I mean, okay.
I'd like to do a song called When I'm Gone, which is about the philosophy of all the songs I write. There's no place in this world where I'll belong when I'm gone, and I won't know the right from the wrong when I'm gone, and you won't find me singing on this song when I'm gone. So I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. Won't see the golden of the sun when I'm gone, and the evenings and the mornings will be one when I'm gone. Can't be singing louder than the guns while I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here.
Every past generation has had to disenthrall itself from an inheritance of truisms and stereotypes. For the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. So in our time, we must move on from the reassuring repetition of stale phrases to a new, difficult, but essential confrontation with reality.
When I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. There's no place in this world where I'll belong when I'm gone, and I won't know the right from the wrong when I'm gone, and you won't find me singing on this song when I'm gone. So I guess I'll have to do it. I guess I'll have to do it. Guess I'll have to do it while I'm here.
We'd been through the sleepwalk, the narcosis of the Eisenhower era. It was time to wake up.
America was represented by these kind of rituals and traditions, with liberty and justice for all. How can you say with liberty and justice for all when you've got a lynching on average of once every 3 days? How can that be? It can be if you are living a lie.
There were a number of people who took the view that this was a betrayal of being American, that things like segregation or war on Indochina broke my American heart, that the way they'd been raised was somehow false, and they wanted to believe in the dream.
It changed drastically when John F. Kennedy got elected. It was the new frontier. Rather than war, let's have the Peace Corps. It was the political utopia of liberalism.
The kids started rising up against the unfairnesses of life. So much of Phil's work ended up being about the things going on in America during the 60s.
Elvis Presley changed their world culturally by singing songs, and I guess they thought, well, perhaps we could change the world politically through singing songs as well.
He walked all over his own growing land, from the New York Island to the California sand.
We went to the local school, which was primarily agricultural, and I believe we were the only 2 Jews in the school. And so we learned what it was like to be Jewish. Oh, you're Jewish. So we learned how to fight.
And now he's bound for glory.
The first music I was interested in was Presley, was Hank Williams, was Lefty Frizzell, Farron Young, Webb Pierce. That was the first music I liked. Jim Glover was my roommate at Ohio State.
I walked past his room, and he was in there playing his records.
He taught me how to, my first chords.
We started talking, and when he found out I played guitar, he got really interested. When I said folk music, he never heard of the Weavers, Pete Seeger. I kind of introduced him to the left-wing music, you know, the people's music.
Now they sing out his praises on every distant shore. But so few remember what he was fighting for.
We grew up totally apolitical. There were no politics whatsoever. And Phil went to Jim's house for dinner, and his father was very left-wing.
My father was a fellow traveler for the Communist Party, so I used to tell Phil about McCarthyism and all that stuff. Phil had gone to military school, and all of a sudden he becomes excited about left-wing politics. So he had this conflict right from the start.
I mean, the thing to remember about Phil Ochs is that left-wing politics was his career. But what was in his heart was not left-wing politics at all. What was in his heart, as we know, was John Wayne and Gary Cooper.
There's an American mythic tradition of the individual who holds out on the jury or chases away the bad guys and so on.
Quite a few of that generation. You can see it in their iconography, that single figure that was going to make all the difference.
To be the hero that saves the country, is something that I think he did strive for.
Phil grew up in the movie theaters, and I think that's what really created that America is a great country, and America, you know, the good guys should fight the bad guys.
I imagined him the sort of guy who maybe if the radio's on with a song that seems to suit the mood of the moment, he might fade it out before he opens the door to get out of his car. You know, start scene now. He was kind of the hero of his own movie.
And right then it was like the election was coming up.
For the 1960 election, Kennedy against Nixon, Jim Glover was sure that Nixon was going to win, and Phil swore Kennedy would win.
Phil said, "You want to bet?" I said, "Yeah, let's bet. I'll bet $50 against my K guitar." Phil really wanted the guitar, so he won the guitar and the bet.
Jim Glover and Phil started a folk duo. They actually broke up before the first gig. Jim decided he was going to be a professional singer and went to Greenwich Village. Later, Phil dropped out of school. And he said, "That's it. There's no reason for me to finish. I'm going to New York. I'm going to become the best songwriter in the country."
Sometimes on my way to another working day on my way.
Greenwich Village was the place. Everybody wanted to go to Greenwich Village.
Those were the golden years.
The Village was the core. The sights and the sounds, the sensory overload was just unbelievable. My first night at the Gaslight, the musicians, the poets, I'd never heard anybody read a poem before.
But I have no time to play, and I hope that I will see you on my way.
Phil was really there to have a good time. We all were.
Well, sometimes I am happy, sometimes sad.
And let's face it,
thinking of the good times I have had.
Folk music was an art that was pretty easy to get into.
Sometimes down, sometimes up, sometimes in.
I was living with Jane in her apartment on Thompson Street. I met her playing at the Raffio. She invited me up to her apartment, and we became a duo. And Phil showed up one day. "Hey, what you doing, man?"
They had been a duet. Now we were three people, and I was sort of like the new kid on the block for their relationship.
Gene couldn't stand the fact that Phil was a slob, and he took all of Jim's time. So Gene couldn't wait to get Phil out of the apartment. So there was a good friend of Gene's named Alice Skinner.
My impression when we met, you know, we were two rejected people. And some of that even can be an attraction sometimes, you know. But it seemed to work. Phil and I moved to 178 Bleecker Street, right in the heart of the Village.
Everybody hung out their apartment. It was a very cool place.
Bob and Susie would come over for dinner sometimes, and people would start coming, knocking on the door, and Dylan would jump out the back window and leave.
Eric Anderson was around there a lot. Peter Lafarge.
David Blue, Dave Von Ronk.
See, the thing is that I consider it a movement, what's going on there. There's also other people like David Blue and Eric Anderson and Tim Hardin. who you've probably never heard of, but there's a whole bunch of people in New York City writing much more advanced kind of songs.
This little group of folk singers always used to get together at various apartments. Say, here's my new song, what have you written and what have you done? And they would tear each other to pieces.
These guys were starting to want to make it. The competitiveness starts to set in.
They saw themselves as a sort of school of artists, like the Second Viennese School or the Flemish painters. They were all quite pleased with themselves.
We just all felt we were part of something very important.
But Phil Ochs stood out. He always had this tremendous curiosity. And so he wanted to know, what did I think about this? What did I think about that? It's just a torrent of questions.
I mean, he loved the writing. He'd stay up all night with the newspapers finding material for songs, and he loved that process.
Well, it's of a bold reporter, a story I will tell. He went down to the Cuban land, the nearest place to hell. He'd been there many times before, but now the law does say the only way to Cuba is with the CIA.
I once went up to a little magazine called Broadside, and I invited both Bob Dylan and Phil Ochs to come up there with me. And I sat back listening to song after song that they'd just written within the last few weeks. And I thought to myself, here I am with two of the greatest songwriters in the world. And someday they'll be famous. Right now, nobody is printing them except this little mimeographed magazine, 500 copies.
Is there anybody here who'd like to change his clothes into a uniform?
For me, I'd been a folk singer interpreting ballads. I was longing for a way for that to come together with my other interest, which was politics. And that's what Phil brought for me.
Is there anybody here with glory in their eyes, loyal to the end, whose duty is to die? I want to see him, I want to wish him luck, I want to shake his hand, gonna call his name, put a medal on the man.
So much of Phil's work ended up being about the unfairnesses of life, about which a lot of the political stuff would focus.
The thing about Phil that made him interesting was he was totally unequivocal. He was determined, precise, literate, but already filled with rage and political purpose in his songs.
He slowly squeezed the trigger, the bullet left his side. It struck the heart of every man whenever his felon died. Too many martyrs and too many deaths.
Topical song movement evolved out of opposition to segregation, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement in general, subsequently the Vietnam War. Without those howling injustices and outrages, there would have been no protest song movement. Probably there would have been no folk song movement.
And then there came the boycotts and then the freedom rides. And forgetting what you stood for, you tried to block the tide. Oh, the automation bosses were laughing on the side as they watched you lose your leg on the chain, as they watched you lose your leg on the chain.
Phil would play anywhere. There were the club things. There'd be a multi-artist thing. You'd hear about all these causes that needed help. He would go to the South and do civil rights things.
Bodies you will find. Oh, the calendar's line when it reads the present time. Oh, here's to the land you've torn out the heart of. Mississippi, find yourself another country to be part of.
It was a great way to reach people through one's music. Phil would actually turn down a commercial job for a benefit because the benefit would usually reach more people.
No matter how small the group or big the group, whenever anybody asked, I can never remember him turning down anybody, any benefit, any chance to sing for a cause he believed in. Phil Ochs was there.
Those guys were true believers. Those guys would show up, you know, for the opening of an envelope to give $10 to some guy that was handing out crackers on the Bowery. to sing a song for the cracker hander-outer guy.
Phil went down to Hazard, Kentucky, because there was a miners' strike.
Well, some people think that unions are too strong. Union leaders should go back where they belong.
We got to sleep in bathtubs so that when they came and shot up the rooms at night, you wouldn't have bullets bouncing off, and it was cool.
Well, mining is a hazard in Hazard, Kentucky, and if you ain't mining there, you're awful lucky, 'cause if you don't get silicosis or pay that's just atrocious, you'll be screaming for a union that will care.
There was sort of a very kind of practical, moral politics that had to do with a sincere feeling that people should be treated equally.
But if you want to get together and fight, good buddy, that's what I want to hear.
His political passion wasn't just out of emotion. I mean, Phil really knew his stuff.
His politics were on the left, and that's very true, but he had a way of picking up all kinds of friends, people on the far left, and he had one or two friends that I would call right-wingers.
They were his political friends, and I didn't like any of them at all. I particularly disliked Jerry Rubin. In a way, my own conservative politics were created by Phil Ochs, or at least he brought them out of me.
He was a liberal guy, but not in that kind of didactic, stupid, if you agree with me on 99 things but not one, you're not my friend anymore.
Phil was never cool. You know, Phil was right there. He exposed himself in a way that was ultimately lethal.
Folk singer Phil Ochs, former Ohio State undergraduate.
Thank you, you're under arrest. I sold out this morning.
Phil's mood at this point had to be totally euphoric. He's being taken seriously, coming up with song ideas faster than he can record them.
As the first troops land and step into the sand, the flags are waving. The Marines have landed on the shores of Santo Domingo.
His name is Phil Ochs, and he records on Elektra Records.
What we were looking for was more and different material. I wanted a steady flow of topical song and commentary, and all you had to do to get source material was open up the New York Times every day.
Sailing over to Vietnam, Southeast Asian Birmingham. Well, training is the word we use, nice word to have in case we lose.
I was writing songs about Vietnam, 1962 and 63, even when Kennedy was still around.
To keep Vietnam free for good old democracy.
When things like Vietnam go on, it just reacts inside of me. I get so repelled by certain things, or they strike me as funny or weird or strange, and my response comes out in the form of a song.
And 15,000 American troops, give or take a few thousand American troops.
Phil had what was essential: a stance, 6 strings, and an insistent voice wanting to be heard.
It's the sound of freedom calling, ringing up to the skies. It's the sound of the old ways of falling. You can hear it if you try.
The songs never struck me as like commercial pop, but he was predicting such great things for this record. He said, I'll be willing to bet you anything this is going to sell 1 million copies. It wasn't even recorded.
You can hear it if you try.
Newport Folk Festival was coming up, and that was a huge, thing for Phil and for everybody involved.
I don't want to deny the next singer at least his 2 songs. And you'll wish when you heard him that there's a lot more time for him, too. It's Phil Ochs.
Well, I think whenever there's a deep tragedy, there's also present something of the ridiculous, which is also true about integration. So I'm sure you'll remember a little town called Birmingham. So I'd like to do you a song now called Talking Birmingham Jam. Walking down to Birmingham, way down south in Dixieland, I thought that I would stop a while, take a vacation southern style. Got some southern hospitality down there in a southern hospital. Well, I've seen travel in many ways. I've traveled in cars and old subways. But in Birmingham, some people chose to fly down the street from a fire hose, doing some hard traveling from hydrants of plenty.
That Newport was when the singer-songwriters came into their own. Sis Cunningham called all the new singer-songwriters Woody's children. You know, that was sort of the first really public crowning of the king of folk.
The smell of blood was in the air, the challenge was laid down.
Phil said, you know, I went to New York to become the best songwriter in the country, and then I met Dylan, and I decided I'd be the second best.
I don't remember the competitiveness between Phil and Dylan. I'm sure it was there on some level, but they really got along. They had some real, ways that they clicked, and they could just go on and on and on together.
He idolized Dylan, and he wanted any acknowledgement from Bob, that even existed.
Dylan refused to ever give him his due.
Dylan despises what I write. I've talked to him at some length about this. And, he can't accept what I'm doing because it's political, and to his mind, it's therefore bullshit, because I'm not writing about myself and my deepest emotions he feels. In other words, he thinks that I could be much more honest with myself.
Oh, I am just a student, sir, and only want to learn.
Phil was so vulnerable to him, but Dylan would play with him, the way a cruel person might when you know that you have the full affection of someone else and you toy with it. And that went on over and over with Phil and Dylan, and it was a very big part of Phil's pathology, as it were, I believe.
Here's the man I most respect in the world, Dylan, telling me this. And yet it's been a help to me in a sense, because it's made me question what are my reasons for writing these songs? Am I a complete phony like Dylan thinks? Is that true?
The big falling out with Dylan was over, can you please crawl out your window? Dylan said, what do you think? And Phil said, it's shit. And Dylan stopped the car, didn't he, in the snow, and said to Phil, get out.
He was such a prick.
Phil's very tough, grainy songs like Santo Domingo, Love Me, I'm a Liberal, Here's to the State of Mississippi, were far more political than the much more, and tough-minded, than the much more generalized, accessible Blowing in the Wind. There was a difference between people who liked Bob Dylan. Anyone could like Bob Dylan. Everybody did. And those who even knew about Phil Ochs.
To ask a question like, do you really believe in these songs, it's like a put-down as far as I'm concerned.
How do you react to statements like this? Don't be so negative.
Well, I punch him in the mouth.
When I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now.
For simplicity's sake, let's divide the 60s into two halves. The first half started more innocently, believing in the redemption of the American dream and all that through direct action, young black students wearing ties, marching into jail in the South. We actually thought that through the force of morality and persuasion, we were going to take the new frontier to a more progressive or radical conclusion. And I actually believe we might have.
Just Kennedy's presidency, was so profound. And he was such a hope for that generation.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
How a man so filled with life, even death was caught off guard. That was the president, and that was the man. Here's a memory.
The murder of Kennedy was the first warning that there was something fundamentally dangerous about embarking on social change.
Of command. Yet a part of you.
He couldn't breathe for weeks after Kennedy died. Really, really admired Kennedy, looked up to John Kennedy.
Phil, like most of us, totally fell apart. It was the end of, it was losing one's father.
And that was the man.
In our case, for the second time, our father died in April of '63.
He had died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And they were bringing his body to New York the next day for a funeral. So I called up Phil. I said, Dad's funeral is tomorrow. And his response was, do I have to go?
My father came back from the war in '44 and started to show mental problems very soon after his discharge. He would do stuff that was extremely manic. He would drive exceedingly fast. He would just go in manic binges, basically.
All I know is that when he came back, I guess he was taken almost immediately out on Long Island to some mental facility.
And stayed for a couple of years.
These are the casualties of the spirit. Born and bred in peace, educated to hate war, every man has his breaking point. And these, in the fulfillment of their duties as soldiers, were forced beyond the limit of human endurance.
None of us knew him. I mean, he was a non-entity. He was not there.
My mother was from Scotland. She came from a nouveau riche family, and she had never worked a day in her life.
She was a very miserable person. She was very unhappy because he was not a successful doctor. I remember on the weekends, my mother saying to my father, "Take those damn kids out of here so I can have some peace and quiet."
She didn't even refer to us as you stinking kids. She referred to us as you stinking Americans. I mean, it was that close of a family.
When I was a boy in Ohio.
I guess I didn't get caught up in the usual social whirl of high school that might have led me into becoming another good fraternity man and becoming a solid accountant or lawyer or later. A lot of my childhood was spent in other pursuits. I mean, like when most people were playing ball games, I was playing the clarinet, doing other things, searching, experimenting with music and other things and movies.
I confessed I'd been to the movie show.
I was escaping, probably from some psychological problems.
Ohio.
My father's death is the first time the family's together in years. If you can imagine the scene of the limousine going to the gravesite, my sister, Phil and I, my grandmother, Fanny, and my mother. And my grandmother always hated my mother and believed my mother drove him to the early death. So the tension in the limousine is unbelievable. And at this point, Phil decides to tell Ma that Alice is pregnant and he's going to marry her.
I was pregnant, and the decision was going to be made between the two of us, and we both had to make it. I mean, look at the situation we were in. The career thing was so intense that it was just more on his plate, for sure. But we did it. We show up at the court, and I'm 5 months pregnant, and the judge says, "Did you guys just meet on the street and decide to get married?" I could just see the two of us like two little kids with this baby. She was the joy of his life. Having a child was never a burden to him. I mean, he really did love it. He loved Megan. It was safe to love a child.
Marine Skyhawk jets helped to clear a rice paddy south of Da Nang, believed to be under Viet Cong control.
Johnson won over Goldwater in the fall of '64. In early '65, he started what's called the Great Society program. So you had Medicare and aid for dependent children. You had a lot of social programs being come in. But at the same time, then you had what's called the Rolling Thunder invasion of Vietnam.
While we're dragging them down to the path of never returning, but we'll condescend to talk while the cities are burning. But please be reassured.
We Americans know, although others appear to forget, the risk of spreading conflict.
We see no other war.
I remember seeing Phil rally with Martin Luther King at the United Nations singing against the war in Vietnam.
Let us save our national honor, stop the bombing, and stop the war.
I mean, I'm a young man, and the government wants to ask me to go over there and die, possibly, or to kill for doubtful reasons. And I say nonsense, absolute nonsense.
The whole draft was totally unjust. Rich kids, college kids got out. Poor kids, black kids, poor white kids were drafted.
That someone's gotta go over there, and that someone isn't me. So I wish you well, Sarge, give 'em hell, kill me 1,000 or so. And if you ever get a war without blood and gore, I'll be the first to go.
There was a resistance movement that developed because people felt it was not a just war and they didn't want to fight. And that's what Phil sang about.
Oh, I marched to the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the early British wars. The young land started growing, the young blood started flowing, but I ain't a-marching anymore.
The second album was I Ain't Marching Anymore. He's much more confident as a singer, more confident as a guitarist.
It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all?
The highlight of that album is the title song, I Ain't Marching Anymore, which became the anthem of the anti-war movement.
To end all wars. Oh, I must have killed 1,000,000 men, and now they want me back again, but I ain't marching anymore.
The Army didn't get us into Vietnam, and I think Phil understood that. Politicians get you into wars, and military people die. The rest of the sort of New York scene wouldn't really talk out loud like that. He understood all those things. He was willing to say things like that.
In every American community, you have varying shades of political opinion. One of the shadiest of these is the liberals. 10 degrees to the left of center in good times, 10 degrees to the right of center if it affects them personally. I cried when they shot Medgar Evers. Tears ran down my spine. And I cried when they shot Mr. Kennedy, as though I'd lost a father of mine. But Malcolm X got what was coming. He got what he asked for this time. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Get it?
Abbie Hoffman said way back when that the worst enemies of the movement and change were not right-wingers, it was the so-called liberals who didn't think they were part of the problem.
I cheered when Clinton was chosen, my faith in the system reborn.
I was surprised how little I had to change in the lyrics to make that song about Bill Clinton yuppies. And oh, take out Clinton, put in Obama was chosen, my faith in the system reborn.
So love me, love me, love me.
I'm a liberal.
He was independent, and he took on whatever was ridiculous, even though he was ridiculous too, but he was ridiculous in a very decent way. You know, he was really devoted to peace and justice.
Show me the country where the bombs had to fall. Show me the ruins of the buildings once so tall. And I'll show you a young land with so many reasons why. And there but for fortune may go you or I, or I.
Phil was as aggressive with his career as he was with his politics. He wanted to be managed by Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, and Phil actually talked him into it. That only lasted for 6 months.
I mean, there was no way that Phil Ochs could be in the same stable as Bob Dylan and move ahead.
Phil, believing he could do anything, figured, I'll create my own Albert Grossman.
And then first thing we did was going to Carnegie Hall and sneaking in and saying, someday this will be ours. We knew that we could fill the place.
We'll do a song then about revolution. This is a fictional song, a cinematic song. As a matter of fact, the song is so cinematic that it's been made into a movie. John Wayne plays Lyndon Johnson. and Lyndon Johnson plays God. I play Bobby Dylan, the young Bobby Dylan. In a building of gold with riches untold live the families in which the country was founded.
He would talk about himself as a star.
He wanted to be like Elvis.
He really wanted to be famous.
Oh, life was a game and work was a shame, and pain was prevented by pleasure.
He became as famous as he should have been. Much of his stuff was really too involved for the common man. He wasn't the Kingston Trio. He didn't make you feel like you were, warming your hands by a bonfire and everybody was singing along. He never made you feel like that. Never made you feel warm and wonderful. I think he made some people really nervous, as a matter of fact.
Missionaries will travel on crusades. The word is given, the heathen souls are saved. Conversions to our morality sigh the canons of Christianity.
After the concert album, I had a feeling that he wanted to go in another direction, and I don't know whether our contract went any longer than 3 albums. It probably did. But it was clear that he was getting itchy feet.
Scenes of my young years were warm in my mind. Visions of shadows that shine, till one day I returned and found they were the victims of the vines of changes.
When he asked for his release, I gave it to him. I wasn't going to hold an artist back from following what they wanted to do.
We all sort of got lured into a more pop dream, and we became a sort of business-oriented operation that destroyed what it was originally.
I got a call from Phil. What are you up to, Michael? He said, I need you to come to New York and manage me.
Phil didn't leave me to go with the William Morris Agency. Michael was not a powerful, established manager. Michael was somebody who would give Phil primacy and 100% attention.
Phil didn't really want a manager. I mean, Phil wanted somebody that would do what he wanted to have done.
New York City has exploded and it's crashed upon my head.
Right now, I'm about to escape out of New York City and go to California.
Escape?
And, I've been trapped by the city and been arrested by the cement.
The landlord's at my window and the burglar's at my door. I can't take it anymore.
The village scene had dissipated. Everybody had sort of gone their separate ways.
It was turning into something else. It was turning into something that was a real drag.
To watch the air get sucked out of the village, I mean, all of the oxygen just go, and it's gone,
So when I took over management, the first priority is to get the new record deal. I figured time to head out to the West Coast and talk to more labels.
Millionaires and paupers walk the hungry street. Rich and poor companions of the restless beat.
I was aware of Phil. I knew about him. I liked what he'd done. And we got together and got along and made a deal.
Larry Marks was one of the in-house producers at A&M, and Larry Marks was classically trained, and Phil and Larry hit it off instantly.
What I didn't really expect after we signed Phil was that he was writing something like Pleasures of the Harbor. That kind of took me completely by surprise.
Soon your sailing will be over. Come and take the pleasures of the harbor.
It'll be a departure from the other records because the 3 records I got out now are all guitar and voice. And the next record will be harmony and counter melody and classical music as much as possible.
Have tied them to the port. The hour will be short for leisure on the land.
Everybody else was going into folk rock, and Phil had no interest in that. He never went with the mainstream. He always found his own direction.
I might not even play the guitar in this record, just you know, other instruments.
You'll be playing other instruments, or just
No,
singing?
not me. Real musicians will be playing. Trained people.
He was very soft-spoken and very respectful, and he knew that the professionals augment what he did. That in collaboration, there could be a great deal of freedom and expansion of his palette.
Oh, look outside the window, there's a woman being grabbed. They've dragged her to the bushes, and now she's being stabbed.
In Small Circle of Friends, where we talk about disregard for human life, which is so mad, and at the same time unreal. You know, we have set up an unreal honky-tonk piano, which I think adds a sense of irony and gives the song an uplift.
Smoking marijuana is more fun than drinking beer. But a friend of ours was captured and they gave him 30 years. Maybe we should raise our voices, ask somebody why. But demonstrations are a drag, besides we're much too high. And I'm sure it wouldn't interest anybody outside of a small circle of friends.
Phil always felt that he was the greatest songwriter, the greatest singer, and that there wasn't any reason that this wasn't going to be the #1 album. Everybody else was relatively realistic about the area we were in, what we were trying to do here, but why dial somebody down like that who was so aggressively, you know, involved in his own career and willing to do almost anything to make it happen?
So the album comes out, gets horrible reviews. But the record didn't totally bomb. I mean, it was no Sgt. Pepper, but it actually did become his biggest selling album.
My Pleasure of the Harp album has been widely attacked, and people love it or hate it, and I happen to love it. We orchestrated every song, in sometimes symphony.
You get along fine without it. Why all of a sudden?
I wanted to extend my musical boundaries.
I think this does it?
Yeah, I think the lyrics are
What about the folk
are
singers who were
scored.
turning rock, like the Mamas and Papas and the Lovin' Spoonfuls?
Oh no, you can turn any way you want. I thought I was much more interested in counterpoint, countermelody, and you know, orchestral, textural sounds rather than just putting a rock band in the back of me.
Well, you're one of my favorite folk singers. I gotta tell you, listen, there's no, there's no question about it. So let's sing.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're one of my favorite club owners.
Okay, right?
I never looked on Phil as being a huge selling artist. I looked on him as being a valuable commodity in the sense of who he was and what he represented and how he spoke for the label, you know. We were just proud to have him. We were proud to be associated with him, and we liked him. He was just a fun guy to be around at that time, you know.
So I snuck up close behind me, and I gave myself a kiss. And I led myself to the mirror to expose what I had missed. There I saw a laughing maniac who was writing songs like this. And my shoulders had to shrug as I crawled beneath the rug and retuned my piano.
He was very, very humorous.
Phil loved theater of the absurd.
And in a way, he wanted to be the most theatrical person that there could possibly be.
I got involved with the politics of the absurd in California, which was a theater demonstration in which we declared the war over in Vietnam.
Realities develop out of fantasy, and it was a fantasy. The war is over if you want it.
This strikes me as the sort of thing that comes to a witty person who's going to sleep at night saying, I know this war is horrible, but even before it's horrible, it's just ridiculous. And it just just doesn't make any common human sense.
I said, Phil, is that enough to just say? Is that enough to say just the war is over?
LBJ was campaigning and doing a speech at Century City. And Phil organized a War is Over demonstration. And they do it outside the hotel where Johnson's speaking, and the cops go crazy.
There was a big riot, and it was called a police riot. And I didn't get injured because I hopped up on a camera thing, and so did Phil with his sign. The war is over.
You spend years fighting against the war on a moral basis, and the administration doesn't listen at all, you know, and you become increasingly aware that you're not having an effect.
Phil decided, let's do it again in New York.
It's going to be a theater piece. It's not a hippie theater piece, it's a theater piece.
And he ran around frantic. When he got onto an idea, he got as manic as most of the other creative artists that you know. And he designed posters, and he got the World War II poster of the sailor kissing. We were going to make it a reality. And we all gathered in Washington Square Park, and he sang the song.
Trust your leaders where mistakes are almost never made. And they're afraid that I'm afraid. I'm afraid the war is over. It's over.
About 5,000 people just went streaming up the boulevards, hugging people. The war is over, the war is over. And it was quite effective because in that moment they had to say, well, what would it be like if it was over?
We ran through the streets against traffic, so it was hard for the cops to follow us, with noisemakers and shouting the war is over, and a lot of people believed it.
I think America has to wake up to the absurdity that it is involved with, and I think street theater like that, you know, it's not going to end the war. I mean, you know, none of the things have ended the war, but I think it's more effective theatrically in getting the absurdity across to these people.
So do your duty, boys, and join with pride. Serve your country in her suicide. Find a flag so you can wave goodbye.
And U.S. casualties continue to climb.
But just before the end, even treason might be worth a try. This country is too young to die. And I believe the war is over. It's over. It's over.
And I have written, you know, my next album ready, and I'm halfway through it, recording it. And where to go, I don't know. Because the next album is a really an album about the apocalypse, much more than Harbor.
Half the world is crazy, and the other half is scared. Madonnas do the minuet for naked millionaires. The anarchists are rising while we're racing for the moon. It doesn't take a seer to see the scene is coming soon.
And while we're doing the album, Martin Luther King gets shot.
Now nothing remains for building or burning. The losing of lovers was all I was learning.
And so the second half of the 60s becomes one of disillusionment, bitterness, alienation, or some would say just a clarification of where we really stood.
And for a war to go on and on, I mean, the Vietnam War, 65, then 66, 67, 68, and this thing wouldn't end.
And even though it was a bipartisan war, it was under the Democrats' watch then.
The Democratic Party has blood on its hands. There's a struggle going on in the world today between young people and between those old menopausal men who run this country. And it's a struggle about what the future of this country is about.
Exploded in pain, then I screamed from all.
There is division in the American House now. There is divisiveness among us all tonight.
Release me from my mind. Whoa, kill me one more time and set me free.
Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And all the high-born ladies, so lovely and so true, have been handed to the soldiers. When in Rome, do as the Romans do.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies.
Kennedy running has changed the nature of it all. I mean, before Kennedy ran, there was a huge underground swelling for a revolution, for an overthrow, or for a total dropout. And now the Kennedy running has having the kind of appeal that he has is splitting those ranks. But still, the feeling is still ingrained that something is terribly wrong with the system, and something has to be done. You know,
we can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of time.
In March, Bobby was flying to Washington to give his anti-war speech.
And after the speech, Kennedy flew back to New York on the shuttle, and Phil and I flew back with him.
Jack asks Bobby in passing if he's ever heard Phil's song, Crucifixion.
Till the universe explodes as a falling star is raised. Planets are paralyzed, the mountains are amazed, but they all glow brighter from the brilliance of the blaze. With the speed of insanity, then he died.
Midway through the song, Robert Kennedy understood that the crucifixion was partly about his brother, John Kennedy, and he was absolutely wiped out on the day that Robert Kennedy finally liberated himself from his brother's mistake in Vietnam.
Teach us to be true. Come dance, 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 'cause we love you. In this overflow of light is crushed to a liar. Gentle soul is ripped apart and tossed into the fire. First a smile of rejection at the nearness of the night. Truth becomes a tragedy, limping from the light. All the heavens are horrified, they stagger from the sight, as the cross is trembling with desire.
That was just like a bullet that went through an entire generation.
I mean, there were so many awful things that happened in the 60s, the war in Vietnam, and you know, both the Kennedy brothers getting killed and Martin Luther King. I mean, it just seemed like one hammer blow after another. And I think Phil was a big enough egomaniac to take it all personally.
With the speed of insanity, then he died.
In 1968, thousands of people came to Chicago to tell the Democrats that the war had to end.
As the Great Society sinks slowly into the Great Lakes, and we stand here, I thought I would give you a very brief history of the birth of the Yippies. And how
Paul Krasner, Phil, and Jerry Rubin, and some others started the Yippie Party.
The Yippies are the Youth International Party, and we're currently organizing for Chicago for the Democratic National Convention.
I'm a spokesman for the Yippies.
You're not Abby Hoffman, is that right?
There were a number of us, Ed Sanders, Ginsberg to some extent, poets, artists, committed radicals, people that didn't believe in art for art's sake, but art for a good sake, for a higher sake.
We were going to Chicago, about 250,000 of young, energetic love buddies.
It felt like we could form what they called in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the early years a united front against the war.
He believed that outraging the country was not the way to go. But at the same time, he liked the Yippie sense of theater.
Phil had expressed what to me was the essential spirit of the Yippies. I'll never forget this phrase. He said, a demonstration should turn you on, not turn you off.
We're going to have a celebration, and there'll be music, dancing, and there'll be just, essentially it's going to be a meeting of the underground. It's going to assemble in Chicago and just show themselves by their physical presence to be a political factor, a political force. That's not necessarily going to be taken in by the
somewhat fraudulent political process.
So the Yippies had their mythology, and what happened in Chicago was a clash of our mythology against their mythology.
Soldiers have their sorrow, the wretched have their rage. Pray for the aged, it's the dawn of another age, of another age, of another age, of another age, of another age.
During the riots after the murder of Dr. King, Mayor Daley issued a shoot-to-kill order, which was meant to extend through the convention. The city of Chicago refused permits for the sound trucks that you would need for a sound stage and electricity. Our claim was that it was unconstitutional to deny people the permits. So by August, you're walking into a situation where you have no permits for anything, which means get out of Chicago or face the consequences.
The media and Mayor Daley have, in some sense, been cooperating, trying to scare people away from Chicago.
If there had ever been any artistic commitment, those plugs were pulled.
And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, Phil, you can't do this. This is not going to work.
None of the rock and roll stars would go, really, but Phil went, I went.
And we'll respect our elders just as long as they're allowed. And when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now.
It was a matter of who stayed to commit their bodies to the First Amendment. Phil was singing indoors at a rally that had been permitted.
A big unbirthday party for Lyndon Johnson there. It was his birthday.
And it was really quite a moment.
Fought in the bloody Civil War. Yes, I even killed my brothers and so many others. But I ain't marching anymore.
Spontaneously, somebody lit up his draft card. And other people lit up their draft cards, and they were burning draft cards all over the auditorium.
There's a kind of euphoria and excitement.
Meantime, let's pick up from videotape the latest installment of the war along Michigan Boulevard.
It became quite violent because Mayor Daley unleashed vehicles, dogs, police, who were heavily armed.
They had the green light, apparently, from the Justice Department because nobody really intervened.
And the boats were tossed about when the fog rolled in and the gas rolled out from Lincoln Park. The dark was turning.
I think Chicago, in a way, was his first gassing and being pushed around and seeing that people could be shot like in an instant.
We took the streets of wine.
We must give notice to this violent few. There are millions of decent Americans who are willing to sacrifice for change, but they want to do it without being threatened. They are the non-violent majority.
I'll go back to the city where I can be alone.
I guess everybody goes through a certain stage of disillusionment, and decides, well, the world is not the sweet and fair place. I always assumed and that justice would out. I always thought justice would out. I no longer think that by any stretch. I don't think fairness wins anymore.
I was growing every day. My life was once a toy to me.
And then after Chicago, musically, and I wrote an album about the death of the American called Rehearsals for Retirement, sort of like the death of the liberal American. And there's a poem on the back of the album saying that the American rule was over, the American day was over, and it ended these last days, these trials and tragedies were, after all, only our rehearsals for retirement.
I take my colors from
let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
And so there's my happy, optimistic viewpoint of 1968. What else do you want to know?
So we cut rehearsals, but it was harder to get into the studio, you know, and his house was just a wreck, you know, he just drank day and night, and it was just, wasn't a pretty sight. It was really rough times for him.
To believe that your generation is going to change the world by its activism, and then to run up against what happened in Chicago, you've got two choices. You either accept the limitations of what you can do and carry on working and see what is possible, or you make no compromise. And Phil, I don't think Phil fancied making that compromise.
I had a feeling, I had a reaction, first of all, against the counterculture. The idea of a freak counterculture was disastrous. I mean, what was needed was an organic connection to the working class. That's what Robert Kennedy meant, that there had to be one country. You shouldn't socially alienate the real working class of America. And of course, Nixon was using that, and he was getting across this image, it's them against us. I mean, no matter what you think of me, I'm a regular, straight American guy, and if you're not going to have me, you're going to have some hairy freak, with dope in the streets and destruction of the country, so take your choice. I mean, that's the game he played, and played very effectively.
Sailors climb the tree, up the terrible tree. Where are my shipmates? Have they sunk beneath the sea? I do not know much, but I know this cannot be. It isn't really, tell me it isn't really.
The Kent State killings were a case in point, that you lived on the edge, wondering in what way democracy was going to take another blow.
You can see the change in the movement. All of a sudden, people are not as political. All of a sudden, the anti-war movement is sort of flagging a little bit.
Or a scream, but I'm not screaming. No, I'm not screaming. Tell me I'm not screaming.
When movements feel they're running up against a stone wall, they start to become more militant, thinking that persuasion isn't going to work, and we have to knock the wall down. So you begin to get bombings of property, Weather Underground. On the other hand, you get people not willing to do, violent property destruction, therefore feeling that they were isolated, stranded, nowhere.
I have been a good man. I've done nobody wrong.
And Phil might have been in that category of despair. You get burnout, you get dropout.
But I'm not dying. No, I'm not dying. Tell me I'm not dying.
He said, in every revolution, there are clowns that precede the real stuff. And that's what I am. I'm a pre-revolutionary clown. So I think he was taking that role pretty seriously.
So I was just sitting around California, getting a little stagnant. And at that point, I mean, having gone through almost 9 years of singing, as a political singer, I had a kind of reaction to it. And so I did my greatest hits trip.
Found him by the stage last night. He was breathing his last breath.
It started out as a joke. I wrote my next batch of songs, and I was trying to think of an album title. I thought, well, wouldn't it be funny if I put out greatest hits, since I never had any hits, and also be a spoof on the industry, because everybody keeps putting on the greatest hits and best of, and repackaging their songs again and again. And what would be the funniest, most commercial cover I could get, and suppose Phil Ochs put on a gold suit. So I did it as a spoof of Elvis.
But God help the troubadour who tries to be a star.
It took 2 days to do the greatest hits album. Got the best arrangers we could. And we wanted to come up with something which was, yes, an entertainment, and that was hence Phil Ochs, his own persona finally revealed in this gold lame suit.
I think everybody who ever stepped on the musical stage secretly wants to be Elvis Presley. And of course, I've always been a big fan of Elvis. He was the creation of this kind of hero image. He totally put together country and western and rhythm and blues, and it sort of fused in one personality and one voice, and one great voice. And that he represented the real sort of lumpen proletariat soul of America through his music. And if there's any hope for America, it lies in a revolution. And if there's any hope for revolution in America, it lies in getting Elvis Presley to become Che Guevara. Because if you don't do that, you're just beating your head against the wall, or the cop down the street will be beating your head against the wall. And that's Elvis Presley. When I had the gold suit in the cover, people started saying, well, why don't you perform in the gold suit as a joke again? And I said, well, why not? Then I took it to New York, to Carnegie Hall, which led to a big uproar.
It didn't really go over. There was some barracking, there was some booing. And, I mean, it took some balls to do, even though he was drinking heavily by now.
All the May had consequences. He had a lot on the line. Phil's career was in need of something positive to happen, and it was dangerous. It was full of a sort of arrogance and recklessness and drunkenness.
I'm listening for gold, but all I hear is Phil Ochs.
Once I knew a sage who sang upon the stage. He told about the world, his lover, a ghost without a name, stands ragged in the rain, and it seems that there are no more songs.
Then into all that, I stopped writing. I mean, then the real problem came. My subconscious stopped feeding me the material. I said, where is it? Come on, you know? And it wasn't there.
You know, he used to get really drunk, and this didn't help his depression any.
The main issue was the fact that he had the manic depression, and that really started to tear him apart.
Because my father was a manic depressive, and because manic depression ran in our families, way back we sort of made a vow to each other that neither one of us would ever commit the other.
And each time the highs would get higher, and then the lows would sink lower.
The mania is like cocaine. It's like you can't, it's like that incredible rush, that incredible energy. And to admit you're a manic depressive is almost negating your creativity. And so for Phil to admit that was almost like giving credit for his talent to something that was beyond his control. One day he said, well, Michael, I've decided that before I die, I want to see the world.
I've been trying to sort of wash a little America out of my system, so I've been going around. It's like taking a bath, you know.
We'd hit a town, and the main things were the museum, the best restaurant for an evening meal, and the bordello. And he used to say, you're English, you have the class, you get us into the hotels, you get us into the restaurants, but I'll show you the street. And I always dreaded the street. I mean, I was terrified of this because he had absolutely no regard for personal safety, absolutely none. We went to Haiti and we went to this bordello in the slums of Port-au-Prince. And there were little rooms with Papa Doc over the bed, and you think, geez, I'm going to get killed. He said, look, no, they won't kill us. I mean, no one's going to harm us. We're American. No one's going to harm us. It's bad for the tourist trade. And I'm thinking, well, what tourists would go to the slums of Port-au-Prince to get laid?
He went with Jerry Rubin down to Chile.
I was there right after Allende came into power, and it was truly a revelation because it was a democratically elected Marxist government. Okay, we're sitting here with Harold Edelstein, who was the Swedish ambassador to Chile.
It was the first time that the people, the working class, had their own representative as a president.
You got to meet Victor Jara, which was basically the Pete Seeger of Chile, who was a national hero.
They were walking down the street and they happened to run into Victor Jara, who saw Phil with a guitar, and he knew who Phil was. And they chatted, and Victor took him to where he could sing for the miners.
And Phil said, Pete Seeger, we're all bullshit compared to this. This is the real thing. He really was, the real political activist singer. They sort of hit it off, and Phil actually did a TV show with Victor Jara. They became very good friends in a very short time. So Phil decides he's going to go to Africa next. Phil was always very clever and very cheap. So Phil was thinking, how can I write this trip off? And he goes, what if I record in Africa? And he finds these musicians.
He called and he said he had some songs he wanted to put down. And I said, call so-and-so, I'll send him a cable and they'll make some space for you in the studio. And we'll pay for it, whatever. And
accidentally, Phil was ahead of his time. He was the first American singer to go down there and do world music. One of the things Phil did was walk along these deserted beaches. 2 Africans jumped him, strangled him almost to death, stole his watch and his wallet, and left him for dead. And Phil wakes up, 4, 5, 6 hours later. Luckily, he's okay, except they bent his vocal cords.
Testing.
I'd like a one-way ticket home, where I can watch my television, talk on the telephone.
He felt he never was able to regain the full use of his vocal cords anymore.
In the middle of conversations, this is what he would turn to, and he'd say, I lost my beautiful voice. I don't have a voice anymore. And he really was convinced that this was done by the CIA.
Well, life just flashed before my eyes. I must be drowning.
When Phil came back to L.A., he kept drinking heavier and heavier. He was driving drunk on Sunset Boulevard, had a head-on collision with another car.
He said, I woke up and I go, what's all these things in my mouth? So I went, goes like his teeth.
I would be in exile now, but everywhere's the same. Take it home. Take it home. I want to take it home.
September 11th, 1973, Allende was assassinated by a military coup in Chile. There were those of us who believed that this coup was not just the military in Chile, but that the United States was involved, that the CIA was involved.
The presidential palace in Santiago was the symbol of power in Chile, something like the White House in the United States. Now it is a bombed-out, burned-out, shot-up wreck.
America had this incredible fear of, if this Marxist government succeeded, it could be the domino effect, the same theory that they applied to Vietnam. Phil researched, and he believed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the CIA had set up this coup.
And it put Pinochet in power, and the military, and thousands of people began disappearing.
To make it totally personal, he found out what happened to his friend Victor Jara.
The Army put several thousand students and professors and Victor all in a big soccer stadium. And they put a table in the middle of this stadium. They said, put your hands on the table. And they came down with rifle butts on his hands till they were bloody pulps. And they said, now sing for us, you cocksucker. And he staggered to his feet with his face white and his bloody hands dripping. And he walked over to the stands and says, compañeros, let's sing a song for El Comandante. And waving his hands, his bloody hands, they sing the anthem of Salvador Allende's Popular Unity Party. And the whole stands hesitantly joined in with him. It was too much for the colonel. They opened fire with machine guns, sprayed the stands, and he was shot with many bullets in his back.
It happened very quickly, it happened very brutally, and it happened to all the intellectuals and all the poets and all the writers. It's like our whole equivalent society was rounded up in the stadium and gunned down.
Phil lost his mind over this and said he was going to do a benefit for to benefit the Chilean refugees.
He goes to New York, puts together some people to help him organize this big concert at Madison Square Garden.
Remember, Phil had been dead before the Chile concert. Phil was a weak man. He was floundering, making a fool of himself.
When Phil was depressed, he wallowed in it. He really did not fight it, and it took some kind of outside experience to bring him out of it, be it the songwriting, be it political benefits.
And when Phil came alive again, people responded.
The tickets are selling so slowly, it's going to be a disaster. Instead of raising money, they're going to lose money. And then coincidentally, Phil runs into Bob Dylan at a club, and he quotes one of Bob's early songs and says, hey, Bob, how'd you like a job singing almost for nothing? You know? And Bob cracks up laughing.
So Bob came over to the apartment, and we were downstairs in that bunker, and Phil had Salvador Allende's inauguration speech, his inaugural address, and he read it, and it was just, we were just blown away, and we were silent, and it was very, very moving. And he told us about Victor Jara and that he had to do this to avenge Victor's death for his wife and child.
And he finally got Dylan to say that he will probably come. And of course, we sold out.
All this, what we're trying to do here is an experiment in aesthetics and politics. We're trying to get across the political message. The mere fact of you yelling more is part of the kind of fan worship.
People were screaming for Dylan and screaming for whomever. And he said, you're not here to fuck stars. You're here to help the Chilean refugees, and you are going to learn about what happened to this country.
That concert was the first time that people got up in public and said that the CIA was behind the overthrow of Salvador Allende.
Elements of the para-state, the United States, were complicit, at the very least, in creating the conditions, the states of emergency, the shortages, the dislocations, the sabotages that, if you like, manured the ground.
This event made this revelation about U.S. policy in Latin America. And it was big, and it had major impact. I mean, it raised money, it produced a lousy set of musical tapes, but a great show.
Okay, this is the end of the show. One more song, Blowing in the Wind, and I'll see you pretty soon in Santiago. Let's take it away.
And I was backstage, and Phil was a wreck. Phil was completely drunk. And Bob started drinking. He was pretty drunk, too.
Even at that event, the people felt that they needed to take care of Phil. Pete Seeger, he's like the daddy of them all. And when he saw Phil in the state that he was in, he said, you got to take care of him. He's got, his voice is too important to lose in the movement.
Chile concert was profound for Phil, too, because it brought him back into what he did best, which was to organize a protest and to do a benefit and do a show. And unfortunately, it didn't stick.
We have adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly, scheduled timetable. The South Vietnamese have continued to gain in strength. As a result, they've been able to take over combat responsibilities from our American troops.
Well, this is supposed to be the cable television, right? So, and we're supposed to be allowed to sing whatever we want, right? So, I'll sing the song. Pardon me, I've lost my voice in the meantime, but that doesn't really matter. Somehow I'll pronounce the words. Here's to the state of Richard Nixon.
I think what Nixon was about, of course, was the creation of a total police state, step by step, the repression on the press, on individuals, on the destruction of the Supreme Court. I mean, just step by step, taking away all the advances that have been made. But he got too arrogant and went too far, and it exploded with Watergate. And when the evidence comes out that he did in fact break the law, that he can't be thrown out of office.
And criminals are posing as advisors to the crown, and they hope that no one sees the sights and no one hears the sounds, and the speeches of the president are the ravings of a clown. Oh, here's to the land we've torn out the heart of. Richard Nixon, find yourself another country to be part of.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Phil Ochs, so what does this mark in terms of eras, in terms of historical perspective? What does tonight mean to you?
Well, I'm very happy that he's gone. I mean, I think he's been a very evil man his entire career.
And is that how you describe the mood of your friends and the people here? Gratification? Is it vindication?
Well,
Feel vindicated?
People are just happy, in general, happy to see him go.
Red blow the bugles of the dawn. The morning has arrived, you must be gone. And the lost patrol chase their chartered souls like old horse following tired armies.
So fast forward, the war is over, and the phones ring, and Phil says, let's do a party.
They only had 2 weeks to organize it, and Phil's energy was unbelievable.
We pulled it together. Lots of phone calls, lots of people working.
There were somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people there.
Show me an alley, show me a train, show me a hobo as he sleeps out in the rain.
And I'm there, and I'm looking at him, and he's incredibly depressed. And I said, Phil, what's wrong? And he's like, nothing. I said, you pulled off the impossible. I said, aren't you proud? I don't want to talk about it. And much later it hit me, that was the last dragon to be slain.
You and I, show me the whiskey.
It wasn't a whoop-de-doo day. I think we had all struggled too long for that day. And I think it was also the beginning of a, what are we going to do now?
Show me a country where the bombs had to fall.
So I imagine that Phil was as confused as the rest of us, and that would just add to the confusion he already had.
And I'll show you a young land with so many reasons why. There but for fortune, go you or I, you or I.
Thank you.
I find it hard to believe that he lost his way because his side won. It was more to it than that.
He had stopped looking outward. See, that's the scary thing. Because before it was all outward, right? It's what do I think about this politician, and what do I think about this action, and what do I think about this person? That's what he did before. But then he got sick, and it was all, what do I think about me? What do I think about me?
Phil Ochs no longer exists. He passed away a long time ago, so all you're seeing here is an illusion, an unimportant illusion.
The summer of 1975, he spiraled totally out of control.
Jet, let's go across the street.
He had been jailed in Las Vegas and was actually thrown in a cell, and he says, guess who it was? Bobby Kennedy. He's not dead after all. I said, wait a minute, Phil. Yeah, and he goes, and I'm now on John train.
Brother gets Spirit Dine, he comes Spirit Dine on his fucking Volkswagen.
He became schizophrenic, inventing another persona that Phil Ochs was a piece of shit and useless, no longer needed, therefore he should be killed.
Now Phil Ochs is dead. Now I'm Lou Train. You're Jet Ringfeld, and you're, what's your name? Gary. Gary Cooper. All right.
He completely changed. He was no longer the person that he was. He was gone.
Second was 1917. I was born 1917.
Phil, he called me up. He said, you know, be on the corner of 6th Avenue and 4th Street and something at 12 o'clock. Something's going to happen. There was this building he allegedly was buying for his company called Barricade Records.
That is called Barricade. House of Barricade, the Barricade Group Limited, Barricade Limited. 25 companies, a multinational corporation on the left is going to buy the world and throw it away. All the money away, give it away. It's spitting money.
There was nothing we could do because he was so crazy at that point. Had we tried to hospitalize him, he did threaten to kill my brother Michael if he did that to him. So he was really gone.
And the last time I saw him, he showed up with a belt with a hammer in it and definitely was transitioning. And then as soon as he saw me, he completely changed. And the belt went away and the hammer went away and he became my father. And on that trip, we went to a flea market and he bought me a set of encyclopedias. He bought me a cat that he named Rimbaud. I was probably 20 years old before I read Arthur Rimbaud, and these are like the seeds that I feel like my father planted for me that over time he meant for me to discover. He meant for me to discover art and poetry and politics.
And you can tell us all about it someday. It's a song about the end of the world. It's called Closing Time.
Some alcoholics you want to push away, and some of them you want to take care of. You know, some of them you have a sense of their worth and their struggle and their gift. They bring out the love and the concern, and I think that's what happened with Phil.
He attracted really close friendships, and that's why people were so traumatized and full of angst at his final years. He just couldn't stop drinking, and I know it was guilt. You know, he felt very guilty about his daughter, you know, and about his marriage. When you make mistakes, there are no time machines to rectify mistakes. So mistakes are lodged like harpoons and fishhooks in an intelligent person's soul. And I think Phil couldn't get beyond those personal harpoons that made him feel in some ways worthless.
And I remember like a very sad conversation with him when he finally came down from it all, which was, did I really offend that person? Did I really say that to that person? And he just was like sort of coming to terms with the fact that that Dave Van Ronk wouldn't talk to him anymore, that he'd been so gross to this one, that he'd slept on the floor of on the street outside this one's house because they wouldn't let him in and all that. And I think that humiliation caused a situation that he couldn't return from.
It was in the wintertime. He called up and he said, can I come for a day or two? I said, sure, anytime. So he came out, and he was just defeated. And it certainly wasn't because he was drinking, because I don't drink and I don't keep alcohol in the house. And he wouldn't even walk to the store to get a cigarette if he wanted a cigarette. He'd wait till I came home from teaching and grub my cigarettes. He just wouldn't leave the house. So he just wanted to play cards. He just slipped into this other world. And he used to sit at the piano day after day playing James Dean of Indiana, a song he wrote, which has such a beautiful, haunting melody. And he would just sit at the piano and play it over and over.
It was on an Indiana farm in the middle of the country, growing in the fields of grain, Jim Dean of Indiana.
And he's sitting alone in this dark little room. And you could just tell by his face. I mean, he was absolutely finished. So I sat down with him and I said, you know, what's your mood on a scale of 1 to 10? And he said, -20. I said, I'll tell you what we do. I said, let's just go for a drive around Long Island. And we drove up to Montauk Point, and it was a very, very windy day, and then we went to a seafood restaurant there, and he ate a lot.
He never seemed to find a place with the flatlands and the farmers, so he had to leave one day.
Then I dropped him off to head back into the city. And I said, what's your mood on a scale of 1 to 10? He said 4. I said, well, that's not so bad. It's not so bad.
He played a boy without a home, torn with no tomorrow, reaching out to touch someone, a stranger in the shadow.
He had flirted with suicide a number of times. I mean, you can see it in the lyrics of his songs for at least the last 3 albums. Yeah, I mean, there's the undercurrent of suicide.
They hoped that he would stay around, and they hoped he would be friendly.
And my last conversation with him, I'll never forget. It was like, he said, I'm really going to kill myself, Michael. And I said, yeah, Phil. I mean, Phil loved food. I said, yeah, give up food, Phil? And he cracked up laughing. He said, okay, good point. And the next week, he killed himself. The next week, he hangs himself.
And Marcus heard on the radio that a movie star was dying. He turned the tenor.
So then I immediately went out to, I guess it was where he was staying, you know, where he'd hung himself. Hung himself off a hook on a door. You know, I went there and looked at it just to see, you know, to recreate it in my mind. I was so horrified. I went out there a day or so later, a few days later.
And that is where I placed a flower for Jim Dean of Indiana.
I think that my father would be ecstatic that 30 years after his death, that people were still interested in him and in the message that he had to convey. But as I said, I don't feel that he would be pleased that the content was so similar and that so many of the battles that felt like they were possible to win had yet to be won.
He was a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine.
Once I knew a sage who sang upon the stage. He told about the world, his lover, a ghost without a name stands ragged in the rain, and it seems that there are no more songs. The rebels, they were here, they came beside the door. They told me that the moon was bleeding. Then all to my surprise, they took away my eyes, and it seems that there are no more songs. A scar is in the sky, it's time to say goodbye. A whale is on the beach, he's dying. A white flag in my hand, and a white bone in the sand, and it seems that there are no more songs. Hello, 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 is there anybody home? I've only called to say I'm sorry. The drums are in the dawn, and all the voices gone, and it seems that there are no more songs. It seems that there are no more songs. It seems that there are no more songs.
Thank you very much. If you will, please, a warm hand for Phil Ochs.